There he is. We're going to be talking a lot about this gentleman for the next couple of weeks. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. In some ways, he's the symbol for America in the 20th century. Can you see right there a sense of exuberance? These big giant spectacles, big giant puke and cartoons. In some ways, this entire unit right now is the beginning of the end of the class. We're leaving the 19th century. We're not going to talk about the 1800s anymore. It's really the 20th century. As some people say, it's America's century. America is going to arrive as a full-blown political power and empire, and it's going to have an important role to play on the world stage in the 20th century. Otto, in this class so far, have we talked about America and foreign affairs very much?
No.
No. We talked about it with regard to the American Revolution, the French alliance, the Napoleonic Wars, which resulted in the War of 1812. We talked about international affairs. We talked about with the war in Mexico. We almost went to war against the British at the same time. Okay, Amanda, you have a question?
Just clarifying centuries and years.
We're right around 1900 now. Okay. We talked about in the Civil War, when the British and the French came close to recognize the Confederacy, we talked a little bit about international affairs. But besides that, we didn't talk about it very much. From this point on, foreign affairs are increasingly going to be important in this class with regards to the 20th century. Get excited. World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, jazz, Vietnam, the Korean War, Elvis Presley. It's all the stuff we've got in the 20th century really does belong right here with regards to the War of 1898. This right here is perhaps the most famous picture from that entire war, which lasted all of 3 months. Okay, here you have Theodore Roosevelt right here. He's on top of San Juan Hill in Cuba. He's leading his band of militia, the Rough Riders, his old cowboy buddies who joined the army as a militia unit and stormed this hill and became war heroes. It's a country which is young. It's maybe arrogant, immature, but bursting with power and energy. Okay, remember, in 1898, the United States produced more steel than Germany and Great Britain combined. Economically, it was a superpower. It was a big country. Politically, it's just beginning to be noticed. It's just beginning to play a role with the other major powers like Great Britain and Russia and France and Germany. Okay? Again, Theodore Roosevelt's going to be the symbol of this new 20th century powerful America. Now, hands down for a second. Here you can see the beginning of the 20th century and the conflict which took place over Venezuela. What was taking place was there was a border dispute between Venezuela and its neighbor, and also Venezuela was beginning to default on its international debts. It couldn't pay back people that it owed money to, in particular the British. So the British were beginning to go ahead and trying to do what they oftentimes did, take control with their military of certain customs operations to be able to seize taxes and actually get paid back by Venezuela for the money that they owed to Great Britain. Now, once they started doing this, which they did to many countries around the world who couldn't pay them back, the Americans actually threatened to go to war with them. President Grover Cleveland sent a message saying, if you do this, you'll be at war with the United States of America. And don't be surprised about that. You know, the United States the British didn't get along at all in the 19th century. There was a hangover from the Revolution, the War of 1812. To hate Great Britain was as American as apple pie. We almost went to war with Great Britain over Washington and Oregon in the 1840s, right? That changes right here, okay? The British go ahead, they take a look at the situation, and they say, you know what? The Americans have this Monroe Doctrine, which says no more Europeans coming to this area. Let's not force the issue. Let's go ahead and play nice with the Americans. Why? Because they could go ahead and see the future. The future was Germany. Germany was up and coming as a power. They're building up their navy. They're trying to build an empire late in the day. And they're challenging the British for being the most powerful country in Europe. And the British say, you know what, if we get into some kind of a war with Germany, it would be nice to go ahead and have the Americans on our side, not our enemy. Okay? They could see that they needed some kind of backup. And later on, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, said, the huge geopolitical fact of the 20th century is the fact that the Americans speak English. The English and the Americans in World War I and World War II are going to gang up to beat the Germans. The British right here begin what becomes known as the special relationship between the Americans and the English, okay? Or as people in London sometimes say, oh, let's go talk to the cousins. Who are the cousins? The Americans. Against the Russians, against the Germans, the British and the Americans, they both speak English, they both study Shakespeare when they're in school. There's a certain joint culture here, and they begin to have a little bit of an alliance. This is the beginning of that alliance, right, between the Americans and the British on the world stage. So it's settled. It's settled by arbitration. The English say, okay, we'll give up our claims and allow this whole thing to go to a neutral umpire, and it doesn't become war. The Americans and the British are going to settle their issues short of war, and even if they don't necessarily always like each other, they're going to cooperate on the world stage to have things in common. Okay? And you can see that America has various complicated reasons why it's going to choose to go the route of empire. Reason number one, power. Thucydides back in ancient Greece, he said this. He said, the strong do what they want, the weak suffer what they must. They don't have a choice. They have to do it. The Americans say, if we don't go ahead and get an empire, we're going to be weak vis-a-vis the British or the Germans or the Italians or whoever. We need to have an empire because this is the age of empire building. And if we don't have one, we'll be weaker than the other people and have to do what they say. Related to that are naval reasons. There was an American naval captain named Albert Mahar. What he went ahead and said, he said that in the 20th century, the countries which control the sea lanes are the ones which are going to control the world, which turns out to be true in the 20th century. And he says, for the American Navy, which is made out of steel battleships, for the American Navy to operate, they have to have coal refueling stations. For example, Hawaii, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong. And if you can have these bases around the world, then you can project your Navy out into the middle of the oceans. So therefore, we also need an empire for our military, for our Navy to refuel. That's another reason proposed to go ahead and do this. Then you also have emotional, right? Teddy Roosevelt. America is a major world country. Therefore, we should have an empire, just like the other ones. Pride of power, another reason to have an empire. Economic. The United States makes enough food and enough meat and enough heavy steel industry to take care of its own needs, and it has a whole bunch of surplus over. Why not take our surplus goods and sell them down in Mexico or in Latin America, or sell them in China or in Asia or Europe? Expanding world markets is another reason to go ahead and move beyond our borders to have an empire. And finally, there are religious and ethical issues. In particular, evangelical Christians who go ahead and say, you know what, let's go to China with our family, we'll learn Chinese, and we'll convert people in China to Christianity. We'll show them the truth of Jesus Christ, and then maybe we'll build them a well, talk about preventable diseases, and then go ahead and maybe even teach them democracy. Idealism to try and do this. China is the main place where American missionaries went to, but they went all throughout the world, right? So for all these reasons, America is beginning to move beyond its borders and to play a larger role on the global stage, okay? On the other hand, you have people who are going to sit there and say, you know what, this is the wrong thing to do. America was born out of an anti-colonial effort. The British Empire we were part of. They were trying to keep us from running our own affairs, and we went ahead and had our genesis. We had our roots in fighting against empire. And now we want to become like the British ourselves and rule other peoples and get involved in their affairs this way? We shouldn't do this. We should go ahead and remain our own country and let other countries run their own businesses. You guys learned about Africa and colonialism, imperialism last year, right? The Americans are coming late to this whole thing. The British and the French in particular have grabbed huge chunks of the world to control them in their empires that way. So here you can see foreign investment. Okay, American foreign investment in foreign countries is exploding during this time. America is moving beyond its shores economic-wise, right? American foreign trade. Here we have 1870. It's relatively small, and it's increasing as the world becomes a smaller place and international trade takes off. Now, the Spanish were the first major colonizers, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay, in the 15th century, in the 1500s, the Spanish, they were the thing. By the 18th century, they're an empire in decline. By the 19th century, they're the sick man of Europe. Okay? Their empire is weak. The Mexicans went ahead and overthrew them. Simón Bolívar down here in South America overthrew the Spanish. And the only place that still was part of the Spanish Empire was the island of Cuba, 90 miles from the United States, and the Philippines over here. It's the only place. In both places, by 1895, had active rebellions. Okay? There was military forces there trying to go ahead and throw them out like they've been thrown out of the rest of the world. Okay? And once this happens, it takes the attention of the United States very closely because it's happening so close to American shores primarily. Okay? So what happened? Mostly in the countryside, Cuban rebels went ahead and got guns and weapons and started shooting Spanish soldiers, trying to get them to leave. Okay? Where was the headquarters of this effort to free Cuba of Spanish control? New York City. Right? That's where they had their headquarters. They would go ahead and they would smuggle weapons illegally from Florida to Cuba. For example, one such ship carrying weapons illegally was sunk, and a war correspondent on the ship, okay, whose name was Stephen Crane, ended up writing a boat about being on an open boat in the open sea. Okay. What was Stephen Crane doing on this boat? He's trying to sneak into Cuba to become a war correspondent, to report on the war, what was going on there, right? Americans did get caught up in this fighting in Cuba. They got killed. There were some American sugarcane fields which were getting wrapped up in the fighting. And what did the Spanish government try and do? What they did is they brought in this general by the name of Valeriano Weyler. And what he did is he took the people in the countryside and he forced them to live in these kind of cities, these artificial cities which became known as concentration camps. These concentration camps is where the population came to live. And the idea was that when you took the population, you forced them to live like this, they couldn't give food and money and weapons to the rebels. You separated the rebels from the people who were living there. And it was an effective tactic militarily, but it caused great suffering and hardship to the actual people of Cuba. What happens when news of this, all these insurrections like we have in Afghanistan, these insurrections are almost always bloody, long-term, ugly, nasty little wars. What ended up happening are the American newspapers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, these newspaper owners, they took news of the fighting inside of Cuba and they splashed them on the front pages of the newspapers. This is called the yellow press or the sensationalistic press. And they did this to go ahead and sell newspapers. I think it was actually Hearst who said, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. I'll get the American people so angry about what's going on in Cuba that there'll be an emotional push to get involved and end this war. Now, was this news from Cuba? Was it bloody? Yes, it was bloody. Did they go ahead and make it even more sensationalistic by hyping it up? Yes, they did. Yes, they did, right? So the bottom line, by 1896, 1897, more and more people are getting more and more upset about the Spanish brutality versus its own people, versus the people of Cuba. Okay? And then if that wasn't bad enough, the Spanish ambassador to the United States writes a letter about President McKinley about how he was weak and vacillating and how the Jingos were pushing for war. He wrote this letter to his government, and someone got a hold of it and published it in the newspapers, embarrassing the Spanish government and making McKinley look bad. This is all combining to be a rising of tensions between the United States and the government of Spain over the issue of Cuba. Right? So what finally happens is, if you could see the future, you could see that Uncle Sam was getting ready to assume the position of the Spanish. Okay? He's going to push the Spanish out of the way and assume that position as a person of the American empire. He's getting himself fitted for an imperialism jacket, right? So finally what happens is the American government pressures the Spanish and allows them to send an American cruiser, the USS Maine, to go visit Cuba. And the idea was that they would be able to see the situation, maybe take Americans who needed protection on board. And the Spanish said, okay, that's fine, although they didn't like it. And finally, the USS Maine went to the port of Havana in Cuba. And then in February of 1898, one night, it blew up. Now, to the extent that we can ever know exactly what happened, they seem to suspect there was some kind of a mechanical difficulty in this primitive kind of battleship, and the engine room exploded, and it went ahead and it killed almost all the sailors on board. Okay. At the time, initially the next day when it was reported that the Spanish government had attacked the ship and blown it up. Some people even say that the Cuban rebels blew it up, knowing that the Spanish government would be blamed for it, that would bring the Americans into the war and allow them to go ahead and get the Spanish out of there, which is getting a little paranoid perhaps. Okay, we never know exactly what did happen. Ultimately what they do is they take the mast of the USS Maine, they take it from the bottom of the ocean, and they take it to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. And if you go right behind the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, you'll see the mast from the USS Maine in honor of the 250 Americans who were killed in that explosion. Raise your hand if you've been to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Right behind it is that mast, the USS Maine, the mast area here of the ship, which they took all the way from Cuba to that place. So the bottom line is this. McKinley had been a Civil War veteran. He didn't like war. He was very cautious. He dragged his feet in all this protest about how bad Spain was acting. But once this explosion took place, the emotional impetus was irresistible. People called for war all over the country, and he had no choice but to say, let's do it. Ask for a declaration of war from Congress. He got it, and it's on. The war is on. So